The Cyprus problem has remained unsolved for decades. It's been likened in many ways to a Rubik's Cube that can't be worked out. In this clip, we look at different definitions of what the problem is, how it could possibly be solved, and consider a number of approaches to doing research on the past and possibilities of the future. Yücel Vural starts off the discussion on what the Cyprus problem is.
It has a strong dimension of ethno-nationalist conflict. It could be defined as an ethno-national conflict, but we need to consider the fact that this conflict has included some other aspects. For example, it has an external dimension. Some key states, namely Turkey and Greece, have also involved significantly, and they affected the problem. So it is not only an ethnic conflict. We know that the Cyprus conflict was shaped during the Cold War, including different and conflicting demands and claims by the two conflicting systems in the world, the Western system led by the United States and the socialist system. And the conflict included some negative effects from that conflict. It is also necessary to say that even today, the conflict is not just a dispute between the two communities. There are several different actors which have interests and which continue to affect the problem. For example, the West now is very supportive of a solution based on the UN parameters, bi-communalism, federalism, and bi-regionalism.
The Cyprus problem, in a contemporary sense, has a lot of history. Alexandros Lollos explains this as a conflict between group versus civic identity.
My own understanding is that it was born out of necessity as the British colonial government was withdrawing from the island, as was in fact the case in many other countries where, from where Britain and other colonial powers were withdrawing. And the power vacuum, the question there was, okay, we're living behind a power vacuum. How exactly will that be filled? Will it be filled through kind of liberal, Western liberal principles of will these democracies be shaped the way contemporary Western democracies are shaped? Or should we accommodate the more tribal elements that we see in these societies? And it seems to me that back in the 1950s and 60s, and taking everything into account, the decision was made to accommodate these tribal elements in Cypriot society, if I may use that expression of tribal elements. I think it's helpful because even though we don't use that word a lot, I think it would probably help us to connect the Cyprus problem to several other tribal and ethnicity-based conflicts around the world. That's why I'm using that slightly provocative expression of tribe. So the decision was made. Similar decisions are still being made today in other conflict zones. Of course, it is controversial because once you emphasize group identity in politics, there's a trade-off between emphasizing group identity and emphasizing civic individual rights, and it's not always easy to reconcile the two. And of course, in Cyprus, clearly we've had a trouble reconciling the collaboration of the two ethnic groups in a consociational model with the rights of individual Cypriot citizens, and as a result, both the groups and the individuals have been suffering.
Ethno-nationalism has developed in different and separate ways in Cyprus post-1974. Nikos Peristianis explains this as a form of consignation.
What has happened, I think, has been described by various articles, scholarly articles, and basically what we see is a movement from the identity with the nation, the Greek nation, enosis, union with Greece, or union with Turkey, or separation and so on. So you had the earlier identifications with the nation that changed gradually after 74 into identifications with the ethnic community, the ethno-national community. So that the new identifications is not so much with being Greek, but with being Greek Cypriot. Not so much with being Turk, but with being Turkish Cypriot. So I feel a Cypriot because I support the Greek Cypriot controlled state. That's the new emphasis. And similarly for the Turkish Cypriots, perhaps a little bit weaker there, because they've got this question mark about the states, some of them on the left. But still, the predominant ideology is their identification with TRNC, not necessarily with Turkey. In fact, there is quite some distance with Turkey on the northern side. So I think we do not have the rise of a civic identity, but the rise of this new ethno-national identity of being Greek Cypriot. And may I say, dare I say, that I would call the two sides, it's as if we've got a kind of cosination. In other words, the Greek Cypriot community, it's like a mini nation, because we still have these feelings with Greece and the Greek nation, but we have stronger feelings with our own community, come the larger imagined community of the imagination, you know, that, so that we kind of feel that ourselves, we are the primary community, which we feel closely related to and which we want to be a part of and which we want to see continue. Sometimes we have a strange feeling with Greece. We feel united, but we also differentiate ourselves. Say the Greeks, the Kalamarades. Sometimes we talk about them positively, sometimes negatively, depending on the context. It's a very common sociological reality, of course. But I get the feeling that nowadays we feel much more strongly this cosination has become more present. And I say that's where this identification with the ethno-national community comes.
One of the key differences Cyprus shares as an international conflict with more recent conflicts is the existence of an agreed framework for a solution. Yücel Varel explains this.
The Cyprus dispute is a predictable one. Now, it is very possible for the international actors to control the processes. There is a well-known framework towards resolving the problem, unlike other conflicts which are newly emerging, like conflict in Ukraine, conflict in Syria, conflict in Iraq. Unlike those conflicts, here in Cyprus there is a framework which is being supported by the international community, a framework on which the two conflicting sides have managed to reach a general agreement. I'm talking about the agreements made by the top leaderships.
Mm-hmm. Track one lead.
Yes. And unlike other newly emerging conflicts in the world, here in the Cyprus conflict, there is a clear involvement of the United Nations and the European Union. So while considering the possible implications of the newly emerging interstate conflicts in the region or in the world, we need to consider these distinct features of the Cyprus conflict.
While the framework for a solution has existed for many decades, reaching a destination, reaching a resolution, is something more complicated. Alexandros Lordos explains.
It was an effort to reconcile the demands of the two sides as these had evolved, especially following the events of 1963 and the events of 1974. So it's interesting actually to go back to 1964 when the first conversations for a solution of the new Cyprus problem were taking place under UN auspices with the mediation of Gallo Plaza. What we saw back then was the Greek Cypriots positioning themselves for a unitary libertarian style state, and the Turkish Cypriots positioning themselves for a federal solution. the sense after 1974, and of course those positions remain consistent right through the years up to the high-level agreements, and of course in many ways they remain consistent today, even though they have kind of moved to a more subconscious, especially the Greek Cypriot position hasn't really changed, but it has moved from away from being an acceptable, internationally accepted position to being an internally held conviction. But before I go there, after 1974, the mood in the Greek Cypriot community was that we lost. We lost the war, so we have to revise our expectations downwards and reach a peace treaty with the side that won. This is not, I know that this sounds controversial, but that was the mood at the time. It was not spoken publicly, but the conversations taking place in the National Council under Makarios in those years very often amounted to that we have to be realistic. What we were hoping for can no longer happen. And so Makarios took the bold step just before he died of accepting the Turkish Cypriot position for a bizonal bicommunal federation. So that's how it happened. It was supposed to reconcile the need of Turkish Cypriots to feel secure in their own contiguous territory with the need of Greek Cypriots to maintain the unity of the state. Unfortunately, 40, how many years has it been now? Since 77? I'm not sure.
It's almost 40
Almost 40 years later, 38 years later, that goal hasn't been achieved. And this begs the question of what do we do now?
Civil society has played an important role in efforts for a solution. Fatma Asgun describes this as problematic.
We couldn't succeed as civil society, which I was thinking that as track 2 diplomacy will solve this problem. And then I was sorry that is it still track 1 is important? Why track 1, after all these efforts? After all these efforts, still, or we couldn't break this chain. That is my disappointment or new. I say track 1 is very important because we saw some examples. For example, Northern Ireland issue conflict. So in one day, track 1 can solve a problem.
Finally, at the same time, even with an agreement at the level of track 1 diplomacy, the role of ordinary citizens, their participation and comprehension of a solution is, as Alexandros Lordos suggests, crucial.
We need to bring the sides closer to each other. In other words, we need to bridge both the vertical gap in society and the horizontal gap between the communities, if we are to have any chance of succeeding with the federal experiment. And the need for this became most apparent in the 2004 referendum, when after a lot of haggling and brokering, a kind of plan was finalized at some level, at some high-level political level, despite all the pressures and disagreements and so on. But the response of the public had not been accounted for. Exactly. And so the carpet was pulled under the feet of the peace process by the public. And the one lesson that I personally learned and that some people learned and friends and colleagues learned and some other people learned at least for a while, I'm afraid that some are forgetting this lesson now, is that you cannot really ignore the people in a peace process which is not just designed to result in a peace treaty between sovereign states, but it's designed to reach a new constitution. Constitutional processes have to be participatory, they have to be inclusive, because everyone's buy-in will be required in order to make them work. Interstate treaties don't have to be so inclusive and participatory. High-level diplomats and high-level diplomacy is very often adequate, thinking about the needs of the state.